There is a widespread belief today that Americans are ready to retreat from the world, that the public wants U.S. foreign policy to pull back. But this belief is wrong. The 2019 Chicago Council survey, conducted June 7th through the 20th among more than 2,000 Americans, reveals Americans are rejecting retreat. In fact, much of what has underpinned U.S. foreign policy for decades remains widely popular. Again this year, 7 in 10 Americans say it's best if the United States takes an active part in world affairs. Majorities believe that alliances, military strength, promoting democracy and human rights, and participating in international organizations makes the U.S. safer, not weaker. 78% say Washington should maintain or increase its commitment to NATO, and majorities support using U.S. troops to defend NATO allies and South Korea. More Americans than ever endorse the benefits of international trade, both for the U.S. economy and U.S. companies. At the same time, partisan divisions are growing on the threat posed by immigration, climate change, and the rise of China. Americans may be searching for a new way to make sense of the world, but these results clearly show they reject retreat. To find out what else the public is thinking, explore the full report at thechicagocouncil.org/survey.
Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. I hope you liked our movie, and I think you will really like this event, Chicago Council, Engage or Retreat, American Views on U.S. Foreign Policy. I'm Jane Harman, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center. I'm a former 9-term member of Congress and happy to be here, a place where we engage in bipartisan civil conversation, deep research, and active thinking about the future of our world. And in that spirit, let me introduce the fifth time that Ivo Daalder and the Chicago Council are here to release their survey of American public opinion. It's a great partnership that we have with the Chicago Council, and in the parlance of this report and prior reports, it's an enduring alliance. It's also reassuring, certainly to me, to learn the good news in this report, that Americans by huge bipartisan margins continue to support an active U.S. role in foreign policy and world affairs. Much of the vision for that role, a little brag here, started with Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, for whom this center is named, who served as president a century ago. Downstairs in the Memorial Hall, which you all passed through, Wilson's words are on the wall. Part of the quotes say this: "It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, but the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free." Well, that was Wilson's vision a century ago. He tried hard. He died trying, literally. But 100 years later, we're still struggling with the challenges that he raised. And at times like this, as the audience in this auditorium and online knows, this center and the Chicago Council and CNES, about to introduce Richard, and the Trilateral Commission, about to introduce Richard, are needed more than ever to connect deep scholarship and thought leadership to the global challenges. So, welcome to our panel today, especially to our dear friend and repeat presenter, Ambassador Ivo Daalder. Ivo, I think I told you I was in Brussels about a month ago, and I stayed with our current ambassador to NATO, Kay Bailey Hutchison, the former 2-term member from Texas, and on the wall was Ivo Daalder. And we have had a succession of great ambassadors to NATO, including her. She has the tougher brief, I'd say, tougher than the one Ivo had. But she's there, and no one should forget, no one, 2 days before 9/11, that on 9/11, without being asked, NATO invoked Article 5 and was ready to come to our common defense. So also here are Richard Fontaine. I've been hinting about him. Richard Fontaine is the fairly newly minted head of CNAS, we all know that, and also Executive Director for North America of the Trilateral Commission, which is a group that many of you have heard of. I'm involved with it. I'm on its executive committee, but it's back and trying to play a more active role in international affairs. And finally, we have the woman who knows everything, Chicago Council Senior Fellow Dina Smeltz, who will amplify parts of the report. So the program is that I sit down, which I'm going to do right now, and ask them questions to elicit some of their views. And then guess what? We want the smartest audience in the world, that would be you, to ask some questions. Not make speeches, but identify yourselves and ask questions. And I see in the audience a Wilson Council member, Michael Waller, who is a great consumer of our stuff, as I hope all of you are. So welcome to this panel, and let's get going. Ivo, as this is our 5th rodeo, I think, there's some dispute about the 4th or 5th, but we've decided it's the 5th rodeo. I am recalling that all your reports, all your good reports, all said basically the same thing, not identical things, but the same thing, that Americans, by overwhelming majorities, want a robust and assertive U.S. foreign policy. In the 5 years, or 4 years, since we started doing this, we've had a change in government and a change in many of our government policies. Yet, by and large, public opinion has stayed pretty constant. Why do you think this is?
Well, I think the public has a basic view about how the United States needs to engage, and it hasn't really changed even from the Cold War period into the post-Cold War period into the whatever period we're living in now. I don't know if I want to characterize it in any way other than to say it's different. And that is that fundamentally it has bought into what we now call the sort of the post-war rules-based international order and an American role within it as the leader of that order, not only as a country that has created, but it continues to shape and maintain an international order based on 3 fundamental principles. And this poll once again reaffirms America's commitment to those principles. Number 1, that we engage the world in security affairs through allies and alliances. And we have U.S. public opinion supporting alliances now at greater levels than at any time in the 45 years that we have been polling, including that organization we just talked about, NATO. U.S. support, public support for NATO in order to maintain or increase the U.S. commitment to NATO is now at its highest level in 45 years. U.S. support for NATO as an essential to American security is the highest since we first asked the question in 2002. U.S. support for alliances in Asia and in the Middle East remains extremely high, as does the question of whether the U.S. should use its troops to defend its allies. So in all of those ways, public opinion remains robustly supportive of alliances. The second way in which we have tried to maintain this order is through an open economic system based on the concept of trade. And again, the U.S. public is more supportive of trade now than it has been in any time that we've asked questions about trade, including on belief that trade is good for the American economy. 87% of Americans, that's a large number. 87% of Americans think that trade is good for the U.S. economy and it's good for American companies. And then finally, one of the new things we did in this report, we've been asking the question, which actually comes from Gallup, so it goes back to 1946, should the United States play an active role in world affairs or should it stay away? And this year, as last year, we have reached near record high. 69% of Americans think we should play an active role. We've then asked, what do you mean by an active role? Mm-hmm. What is it actually, when you say an active role, does it include or exclude the following? And it includes things like alliances, military superiority, international trade agreements, and it's the third most important, most support is promoting democracy and human rights. still the fundamental belief that the United States has to be a beacon for freedom and a beacon for democracy and human rights, not necessarily to do so through the use of military force, but as an idea that is central to America's role in the world, democracy and human rights, along with trade and alliances, the three sort of fundamental pillars of post-war American foreign policy, are now as supported as they have ever been in the time I've been asking these questions.
So am I watching a different movie? I mean, in the last several years, I've seen statements from senior government officials, whoever they may be, that cast some doubt on whether we're truly committed to NATO, and if they don't pay their full share, maybe we're not, and if we're now moving money away from military construction to pay for a wall, we expect NATO allies to make up the difference to the extent that some of the projects were in their countries. In spite of all that, the American public stays constant.
Yes.
And they are not, are they not buying into that, or they're just tuning that out, or why is this happening?
Well, they're not only not buying in, they're actually rejecting it in a very fundamental way. The idea that our engagement is a transactional engagement with the world as opposed to based on the concept of leadership is rejected. Two very important findings. When you ask, as we have, do you think alliances in Europe or in Asia or in the Middle East benefit mostly the allies, mostly ourselves, or are mutually beneficial? Large majority says they either are mutually beneficial or benefit the United States. So European alliances get support of 60% are either mutually beneficial or 65%, or benefit the United States. Only 20% of Americans think what the president thinks, which is that they're beneficial only for the allies. The same is true on trade. When we ask the question, do you think trade is useful for those we are trading with, us, or for both? Overwhelmingly, the answer is both. So this idea of a transactional reliance, the transactional relationship, where we do stuff in return for payment, whether it is NATO payment or something else, as opposed to we do stuff because it's in the mutual interest of both of us, win-win rather than win-lose, is fundamental to the American conception of our role. By the way, it has been for 75 years.
Right.
The president is trying to move away from that, and as far as we can tell, he's not succeeding with the American public when it comes to foreign policy.
Nina, did you want to add something to that?
Well, exactly what he said, but also we've been tracking it over the past 3 years since Trump's been in office, and in fact, you might expect some of the America First type of policies to get more traction, but instead we've seen the opposite. So we have even higher numbers of Americans now saying alliances are mutually beneficial. We have these super majorities that say trade benefits U.S. companies, the U.S. economy, and relations with the United States and other countries. So it's even underscoring what they've always said over the last 45 years.
Let me probe that more with you after turning to Richard, but I just want to ask you one thing. The Trump base is more or less constant at about 39%-ish. If you do the math with the support that some of these policies have, they have more support. If the Trump base supports Trump and Trump's policies, and that's 39%, how do 82% support some of the other stuff that you were just talking about?
So, well, the loudest part of the elites on the Trump side and the activists that believe the same thing, they're louder and they take up more space in the media and in the public discourse. So, so they still capture that portion of the Trump vote, and they care more, perhaps, about some of these issues than the average American who doesn't always have the time and attention to pay to things about alliances. But that's where the issues like immigration and climate change.
We're going to get to those because I really was interested in
there
your
are some
findings.
issues that are divisive, that are single issues, which might attract some voters, or actually that might be what they are most engaged about.
Right, but as we head to 9/11, the 18th anniversary, an issue like NATO was on my mind because of what NATO was prepared to do. And it's the only time NATO involved Article 5. And Nick Burns, who was then our ambassador to NATO, we've had a slew of excellent ambassadors. Nick Burns, who is a professor at Harvard and also runs the foreign policy group for the Aspen Institute, on which I serve. Nick Burns said he didn't ask, he was just told we're invoking Article 5. So that's pretty darn amazing. Okay, so Richard, we haven't talked about Congress, and you did work there in one lifetime for a hero of mine named John McCain, whose
Felt
voice—
like 2 lifetimes. But.
2 lifetimes. Whose voice is sorely missed right now. And I just would like you to think about John McCain and what John McCain taught so many of us about foreign policy. For anyone who missed this movie, this is another movie, John McCain was the leader of many congressional delegations on international trips. I went on at least 10 of his CODELs to the Munich Security Conference in Munich, Germany in February, and then I've attended it another decade since. But John McCain, among other things, was the Pied Piper of foreign policy for Congress, and he taught all of us how to think about a world and its challenges. And so, Richard, it would be helpful, just because I think it fills out some of what we're learning here, for you to tell us about that, and also tell us about what you're doing at CNAS and what you're doing at the Trilateral Commission, and how a person outside this report thinks about what they've just achieved. Sure.
Well, I think some of the findings in this particular report would coincide with where Senator McCain came down in terms of America's role in the world. I mean, Ivo touched on this, but since the end of World War II, there have been kind of 3 animating principles of U.S. foreign policy. To keep the peace, we would have strong alliances underwritten by the forward deployment of American troops. To increase prosperity, we'd have an open international economic system undergirded by free trade. And then to support the forces of freedom, when possible, we would have a bias in favor of democratic systems as opposed to autocrats. And the debate between Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals and realists and neoconservatives and everything else was more about how you do those things, how you make the trade-offs. When do you embrace friendly autocrats versus democracy movements? How much free trade? How big a military do you need? Not really whether we do those things. And I think we've gotten to a time when there's a lot of questioning at the most senior levels about whether those are the right principles. Is it really good to have alliances? Is it really good to have free trade, or should we all be sort of tariff people? Is it really good to promote democracy, or we just sort of poke our noses in places where it's not welcome? And the findings of this seem to support the traditional view. And of course, then you get into the arguments about how to do it all and everything else, but it's not a refutation. It's not the fundamental questioning of those principles that you might guess from our policies and our political discourse right now. The fact that there does seem to be, though, the public feeling one way, and our policymakers, not just the president, but a lot of Democratic candidates and others who seem to be in a different place, suggests to me that it's not just the sheer numbers, but it's also the intensity of the feeling among minorities.
Which is what Nina said.
Right. So
on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. So if trade is a perfect example of this, it's diffuse benefits and concentrated costs. Right. So raise your hand if you feel the costs associated with the aluminum tariffs. Probably nobody can feel that, although there is a cost.
Well, let's try that. Does anyone feel those costs?
All right, so for those watching online, I think there was like one hand. But if you work in the aluminum industry and you were going to lose your job, even though the cost, the American economy of keeping that job was $700,000, and that's certainly not your salary, then you feel it a lot more strongly. And so you're more likely to vote on that issue, you're more likely to lobby your government on this issue, you're more likely to mobilize on an issue than the rest of us who don't feel it. And so that is a relevant factor as we think through all of this.
So if John McCain were still in the Senate, I wish he were, what would he be saying right now?
He'd probably be on a plane to Afghanistan right now. I think he would be, he'd be wondering a couple of things. One, as he did, frankly, until his passing a year ago. One is, if we adopt a policy of retrenchment, retreat, disengagement, whatever you want to call it, what comes next? Is it true that if the United States steps back, whether it's militarily, diplomatically, economically, then sort of friendly locals step up in a spirit of burden sharing, fill the gap and do things in our interests that we would otherwise prefer not to do? I think the answer is no. And I think his answer would be no. Is it the case that we can just sort of, get out of Afghanistan, for example, and ask the Taliban for assurances that they'll behave and that they'll treat women and girls appropriately, that they won't overthrow the government, that they won't form a sanctuary for ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and that we can have it all. We don't have to be there, and we can have what we want out of that. And I think, again, the answer is no. And then that puts a set of requirements on the United States for engagement, but that then gets back to the more traditional internationalist foreign policy that so many of our political leaders today say they don't see support for.
Well, let me just stay on that for 1 minute, because no one has missed the news in the last 24 hours about the canceled talks with the Taliban at Camp David. Everyone in Congress except for one person voted to authorize the use of military force against those who attacked us based in Afghanistan. I voted for it. Barbara Lee was the only no vote of 535 votes. And she did that as a matter of principle, and I respect her courage in doing that. At any rate, we prosecuted our case. I would say, looking back, especially when you add in Iraq, that we didn't have an adequate day-after strategy for either of the wars, and we're still in them, especially in the one in Afghanistan. But my question is, if we didn't have an adequate day-after strategy for the wars, do we have any day-after strategy for getting out of the wars?
Well, no. The answer is no. So it looks like, I suppose, that the United States will be staying in some capacity in Syria, essentially pursuant to a deal that Senator Lindsey Graham brokered at the Munich Security Conference to cobble together a remaining American presence with a European presence. But the day after strategy seemed to be turn it over to the locals and hope that things go well after we leave. In Afghanistan, it appears to be, let's get the best deal we can get, making perfectly clear that we're getting out irrespective of what precisely that deal looks like. But anybody who's done any of these things knows that if you want to see certain conditions after you withdraw from a place, you have to be willing to go back in. There has to be reversibility. And does it feel like there's any reversibility to an American withdrawal from Afghanistan? I don't think so. So the day after plan is get these assurances from the Taliban and kind of hope for the best.
Jane?
So, yeah, I want to ask you too, Ivo. It's also harder to go back in once you're out. So what would you say about that?
So I think two things. One, in terms of public opinion, there's no doubt that the public has completely soured on both of these wars,
Right.
and see both Afghanistan and Iraq as failures of American foreign policy. And I think, genuinely speaking, that's probably not a bad analytical judgment on their part. And I do think that there are lessons to be learned. We are now in the third administration when it comes to Afghanistan, 18 years in almost in this war. And not one of those administrations has ever had a serious strategy for Afghanistan in particular. Let me just focus on Afghanistan. Yep. We forgot about Afghanistan within about a few months of getting into it after 9/11 and focused on Iraq and really didn't resource our strategy as well as we should. I've just completed reading Jim Mattis's book, where Secretary Mattis, General Mattis, talks about the failure of getting Osama bin Laden in Tora Bora and the decisions not to put the Marines, which he was leading in Kandahar, into the mountains in order to deal with that issue and everything that has come after. I served in the Obama administration, spent 4 years trying to get our allies to do more in Afghanistan, and by the way, they did. And one of the things that we shouldn't forget is that this is a war that even today,
Right.
1/3 of all the forces that are in Afghanistan are non-American. They're allied forces, both NATO and non-NATO allies, who continue to fight alongside of us. It wasn't just an American soldier who was killed on Thursday. It was a Romanian soldier who was killed on Thursday alongside the American. But we didn't have a real strategy for resolving the issue. And frankly, the strategy we now have is not that different from the strategy we've had in the previous administrations, which is how do we get out without anyone noticing? And the problem is the other guy notices when we leave, and as a result, we'll take actions that are likely to be contrary not only to our interest, but clearly to the interest of the Afghan people.
And I would just add to that strategy may be the wrong word. we're in a transaction to try to achieve a result. You said that yourself.
Yep.
This stuff shouldn't be win-lose, it should be win-win. And I just want to repeat something I quoted from Woodrow Wilson, because I looked at it again, and just have everyone contemplate this, and then we're going to go to Nina. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, but the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments. And I think if John McCain were here, he'd sign up for this. Just absolutely sign up for this. So Nina, let's go back to the report, and then obviously your questions can be on the report and on attitudes of the American people. You mentioned that there are 2 places, I think it's 2, and you mentioned it again, or 3, where instead of the Americans pulling together with more robust support, they are pulling apart. And one of them is immigration, where you say Republican fears about immigration are growing. 78% see it as a critical threat, while concern among Democrats is at an all-time low, 19%. So that's one, immigration 78 to 19. Second one is climate change, which is at the top of the Democrats' agenda. 78% of Democrats see it as critical, where 23% of Republicans see it as critical. And the third is the development of China as a world power. And the majority of Republicans are concerned for the first time since 2002, I guess, since you started doing this. So explain to us why consensus is growing in other areas and diminishing in these 3.
So yes, climate change and immigration have long been issues that are dividing the American people. If you look on page, just if you want to follow along, page 25 shows immigration as a threat. You can see that early on, Democrats and Republicans weren't really that different. Now, in the Trump era, Republicans are actually even more fearful of immigration. And Democrats have been steadily declining, thinking it's not a big threat. And part of that has to do with the composition of the Democratic Party. It's younger, it's more diverse than the Republican Party, which has pretty much stayed the same. And
before we leave that, tell us about your polling sample, because it reminds me, because let's be sure that you did this perfectly.
Sure, I can assure you we did. It was a sample of about 2,000 people. We use an online polling organization called Ipsos that draws their sample from actual addresses. It's not like opt-in polls that you often see in the newspaper, well, not necessarily newspapers, but online a lot of, where people just self-select and answer. These people are actually chosen from a sample in a statistical way so that it's nationwide representative. And on page 39, it shows you kind of how it breaks out according to different demographics. And if you have questions, we can.
Okay, so there's a divide on immigration having to do in part by the composition of the Democratic Party.
Right, and it's growing, and of course, in our data and others, immigration was a key factor in support for Donald Trump, anti-immigration, and he has amplified it in a way that other presidents and political leaders have not done. And you can also see on page 26 that there is actually, despite that huge yawning gap, there is a bit of overlap. And it's funny because in the past, when comprehensive immigration reform seemed like a possibility.
Under the George Bush administration, point out.
We asked about that, and large majorities of Democrats and Republicans support it. You can get a hint of that on page 26. You see that majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and Independent all support a pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrants who agree to pay taxes, speak English, have a clean criminal record, steady employment, and a majority also, more of Republicans, but still majorities also support increasing border security, and that's also bipartisan. So that is the basis of coming to some kind of agreement, but we know that hasn't been able to occur. Then the rest of the items on that list show that Republicans are more supportive of punitive actions, imposing new fines on businesses, carrying out arrests and deportations and immigrant children. So this is an area where, like I said earlier, and which Richard said, the intensity of the anti-immigration minority among the public has really captured so much attention and legislative. Well,
So what about climate change, where you have the flip of that, where
Yeah.
there's huge intensity for aggressive steps to combat climate change on the Democratic side?
right. So we have a brief that's coming out soon, and it's touched on page 28. So Democrats have consistently been more concerned about climate change, and now it's one of their top threats, and several polls have shown this, not just ours, including questions that ask about what Democrats want the primary candidates to talk about right before the election. So climate change has been growing. You know that all of the Green New Deal and a lot of the primary candidates are really talking about climate change a lot, and so it could be that the public has pushed the elites or the elites has pushed the public, but anyway, they're on the same page.
Well, before you leave that though, on the Republican side, are people still denying the fact of climate change? I'm sure there's dispute about the cause, but is anybody missing what just happened in the Bahamas and what happened a couple of years ago in Puerto Rico and all of the hurricane damage and tornado damage in the U.S. and the rise in heat in the summer here?
So we have hints that some polls show that Americans, right after any of these hurricanes or major environmental disasters, usually then say, oh yeah, it's not, we're really concerned about climate change, and it might be man-made or both man-made and cyclical. But we, as a threat, Republicans have only moved a little bit, from 16% to 23%. But they have moved, if you look on page 28, they are more likely now to say that they're less likely to deny it and say, oh, we're questioning whether it's really a problem. And they're more likely to say it needs to be addressed. Right now, a plurality say it's more likely we need to address it, but gradually, because these changes are happening slowly. But that's still, in my view, an improvement from questioning whether it needs to be addressed at all. And part of this politicization around climate change actually happened probably in the 80s when the Reagan-era policies were concerned about regulations on businesses and wanted to undo some of that. And then in the 90s, climate change, global warming got attached to Al Gore, which then created a very politicized view of the issue, much like Russia and Trump are sometimes linked together today. So a lot of that has carried over. But there are some Republican leaders, like stalwarts like George Shultz, James Baker, who've come out with a carbon tax policy. Hank Paulson also has a carbon tax initiative. So maybe as more Republican elites start to debate less about the cause of it and just talk more about how to fix it.
Well, Richard wants to come in here, but I just would comment, this is not specific to the current administration. I mean, I actually, this will really date me, a dinosaur that I am. I worked in the Carter White House, and if anyone remembers, Jimmy Carter wore sweaters to his conversations with the American people, and in the Senate at the time, every other light bulb was, funny that we should talk about light bulbs these days, was turned off on the ceiling of the Russell Senate office building and so forth. So this concern started a long time ago, and it's gotten uneven attention over many years, but I think at this point, many more people see it as a crisis than used to. I'm sure that's fair. Richard, you wanted to come in, and we still need to talk about China.
Yes, the really interesting thing on the Republican side on the climate change issue is the generational split, because I love James Baker and I love George Shultz, but I don't think they're going to be the vanguard of changing Republican views on climate change, but millennials might, because if you look at polling, not in this particular survey, but other polling, including some of the Republican polls that they've done, millennials in general will generally put climate change as their number one national security threat. And Republican millennials sometimes will put it number one as well, or number one or two. And as has been a long time has been the case, if you don't like the solution, it's easier to dismiss climate change as the product of natural variations and things. If the solution is government regulation and big government and taxes and all these things that, as a conservative, small government conservative, you don't like. But now with millennials coming in, they tend to put about twice as much as the oldest cohort on the Republican side. These are self-identified Republicans to say climate change is real and we've got to do something about it. That group is also becoming a bigger share of voters as the oldest group sort of ages out, and they enter the voting base and vote more often. And so what this all nets out to is a number of Republican leaders kind of saying internally, we've got to have a climate change policy, or we're going to start losing millennials, and we may lose them forever if they no longer vote Republican, and this is their number one issue.
And they already are tilted toward the Democratic Party. Much
Well,
more than
it's
others.
interesting. Again, I'm not trying to handicap which party wins. I'm trying to talk about how the public sees these various issues. So last on China, let me just make one comment there. I was elected to Congress in 1992. I remember China as a bipartisan punching bag in the 90s. I remember being called an agent of communist China, here I am, by one of my primary opponents, a Democrat in one of my races, for back in my law practice days, lobbying for the Beijing Chamber of Commerce. That made me an agent of communist China. So, and you know, I'm sure some of you may agree with that, but at any rate, my view is that China has consistently been on a bipartisan basis, viewed as a critical threat. And frankly, just speaking as a Democrat, I give President Trump credit for confronting China with some of the practices that have confounded us for a decade or more. So explain why you see China growing, the bipartisan divide growing on China, and China being viewed more as a critical threat by Republicans.
Sure, yeah, so when we all got together at the Chicago Council with our advisory board and looked at the numbers in China for several years in a row, we were always surprised, confounded. Wow, in Washington it's seen as such a big problem and issue and threat, and the American public doesn't seem to register that. Well, this past year, yes, on page 29, 54% of Republicans see China as a critical threat versus 36. It's not a super high threat, but it's a definite shift on an issue where we don't see a lot of shifts usually. And that has a lot to do in part with the elite cues from the administrations. Republicans are the only group that supports tariffs against China too. So it's definitely catching on. And on page 30, you can see that Republicans in particular are more supportive of restricting exchange of scientific research between the US and China, which isn't great. They are the only, well, Republicans, 74% support placing tariffs, 50% of independents, only 30% of Democrats, and so on. But a majority of Republicans support limiting the number of Chinese students studying in the United States. So it's really even hitting into the diplomatic realm. So yeah, the messaging from the White House is catching on within that constituency.
Okay, we have 15 minutes for audience questions. Raise your hand. A microphone must come to you before you speak. Identify yourself and ask a question. Do not make a speech, please. Do I see somebody in the very back row? No, I don't. Yes, I do. No, on the left, on my left, about 3 rows in. Yes.
Hi, I'm Matt Dessler of the University of Maryland. One quick point and one question. Quick point, we did a poll particularly on U.S. trade in June and found strikingly similar results. I'm not going to recite them because we're not supposed to be reporting, we're supposed to be asking questions, but I just would comment that the results were strikingly similar. One thing that has been apparently true in public opinion over a long period of time is a reversal of the partisan divide on trade. In the 80s and 90s, Democrats were more trade skeptical. Then beginning really around 2000, 2005, Republicans became more trade
So what's your
skeptical.
question?
So it seems to predate Trump, and I'm wondering whether this survey can shed any particular light on that. I know trade was just one of several issues you looked at.
I think part of it has to do with the changing composition of the Republican Party. A lot of the better educated whites in particular used to be a part of the Republican Party, and they've now shifted allegiance. So I think that's part of the response. And part of it is because now that the shift upward among Republicans today is partly because I think a lot of Republicans think that President Trump can improve trade agreements, and so they're banking on his being able to create economic positives.
I would just observe that each party has a strong anti and pro-trade wing, and I think that's been true for a long time. The pro-trade crowd put together is not a majority, I would say, anymore. I mean, maybe in personal terms it is, but I think the USMCA agreement, the new NAFTA, is going to have some tough sailing. It may get through, but maybe it's part of a more comprehensive deal. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
Just
Ivo?
what's remarkable about the trade numbers isn't actually the partisan difference, it's the part of a partisan difference. So the difference between Republicans and Democrats on whether international trade is good for the U.S. economy is 2 percentage points. Between whether it's good for American companies, it's 5 percentage points. And whether trade is beneficial for U.S. relations with other countries, the difference, partisan difference, is 0. 90% of both Democrats and Republicans think that trade is beneficial for relations of the United States with other countries. So we have a very strange phenomenon that, in fact, both Democrats and Republicans are now becoming more and more pro-trade. I think Dina's right that one of the reasons Republicans are becoming more trade is because they think that the president has an effective policy for promoting trade. And so when you start digging deeper about what is it that we should be doing, you're going to have a much greater partisan difference. But overall, you now have a basis for thinking that trade is less of a political football than it used to be.
Okay, we're going to keep questions shorter and answers shorter so we get to more of you right here in the third row in the blue shirt. And then we'll go to you in the front row. You're next. Mic isn't working? No. Do we have another mic? Put it right next to your mouth.
Hello.
There
Yeah,
you go.
it's my bad. Sitke Özkan from Kronos News. I have a question at the intersection of military alliances with other countries and trade. There's a very interesting figure on page 16 saying that selling weapons to other countries makes us less safer. But it's by 70% of the Americans think that. And 74% of the Americans think that military alliances makes us safer. And 87% says international trade is better for the U.S. and the U.S. companies. So what do you think about this?
Good question. Okay.
So just to take a first stab at that, Americans don't like selling weapons to other countries. Whether allies, we don't ask a question about allies with one exception. We ask about Taiwan, whether selling weapons to Taiwan is a good thing or a bad thing. That was what page, whatever it was, we just had on the China pieces. And there too, bipartisan majorities.
30.
In page 30, bipartisan majorities think that selling arms to Taiwan is a bad idea. So there's just a very strong negative bipartisan view that selling weapons is it doesn't make Americans safer, is not a good thing to do. That said, I'm sure that if we change the way the question gets phrased, which is, do you believe the United States should sell military equipment to our allies so we can fight better together? I'm pretty sure that we'll get very high numbers saying, yeah, it makes sense for our allies to fly F-18s when we're flying F-18s. But as an issue, the president in particular has raised weapon sales as sort of be all and end all, including with our relationship with Saudi Arabia. The American people aren't buying that one.
Front row over here. Hold on.
Thanks, Jane. Kevin Barron from Defense One. I wonder if you could talk a little deeper on U.S. military engagements and public support for them. So I heard two things here. I heard, Richard, you say, Americans support the traditional view of being robust, international, global engagement, but at the same time, Ivo said it's clear Americans are tired of these wars. So since we're talking Afghanistan this week and we're at that point, which one is it? Or do they support Afghanistan or not? I know it's not that simple, so tell me what you know and why that is.
Yeah, the military intervention in these polls, polling numbers and in others is distinctly unpopular, and I would put in a different category from the other forms of American engagement in the world. So you can see this, if you define engagement as trading relations and diplomatic relations and alliances and all the other kind of things that they ask about, those numbers are high. So that's American engagement. Military intervention, given the costs associated with those interventions over the past 2 decades and with the perceived lack of results of those interventions over the past 2 decades, has made this a distinctly unpopular activity. Now, that said, again, it gets to what is the intensity of the opposition. Does that automatically translate, for example, to a president saying, well, the American people don't want to be in Afghanistan anymore, I have to sort of pull out completely? No, I don't think so. If you look in popular opinion traditionally, support or lack of support for a war has been related to what are the costs financially and in terms of casualties, and what are the perceived progress or lack thereof toward a particular objective that is stated. And if you have progress towards an objective and relatively low costs, people may not actually like it, but they would acquiesce to policymakers thinking that it's in the interest of the United States to continue doing it. It's when they see high costs and no progress, that's when a war becomes very unpopular, and that's what we've had in these various wars over the years. And so as an enterprise, military intervention is the one element of sort of traditional American engagement that's gone downhill in the polls very quickly.
Let me add, Kevin, because I think this goes to the heart of what we're seeing here, which is that in the normal foreign policy elite circles, which we all live in, there's this assumption
in the swamp.
There's this assumption that if you think that wars like Iraq and Afghanistan have been high cost and perhaps not immediate benefit, that if you're against that, then you're against all things military, and you're no longer willing to be tough, and that toughness is the willingness to intervene in other countries. This poll says something completely different. It says that, in fact, the way you make America safe is the traditional way in which the United States has made America safe, which is U.S. military superiority, strong alliances, basing forces in overseas, being willing to defend your allies when they're attacked. All of those, there is 50, 60, 70, 80% of Americans support that, including defending allies. 69% of Americans think that the United States should use troops to defend South Korea if North Korea invades South Korea. That 54% think that U.S. should use troops to defend NATO allies like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania if Russia attacks. And forward basing, continues to be strongly supported, particularly in Asia, a little less in Europe, but still there is support for that. Where there is no support for it is military intervention to resolve conflicts, which is how we made the question. Yes to defending allies, yes to being there, yes to being strong, believing in deterrence, but no to the kind of interventionism that we've had in the past sort of 20 to 25 years. That's where the distinction lies. Doesn't mean that if you think that Iraq and Afghanistan were the wrong thing, that therefore you don't believe in using military force. No, it believes that maybe doing it in a stupid way, dumb wars, as one presidential candidate who turned out to be pretty successful when he said it, would talk about, are not the way to do it. But that doesn't mean you're against alliances. Right. It doesn't mean you're against military force. It doesn't mean you're against spending on the military. It means that you want to have a strong American presence in the world without necessarily having to use it in some places that have not proven effective.
And I would just add, Ivo, I think this is true, that the use of military force is not our first option.
Right.
We have robust, and Lindsey Graham, as an example, would say this, if we have a robust diplomatic and other presence in the world. And then we can avoid a lot of wars. And I think everybody would be for that, including Woodrow Wilson. We have a question over here. Fourth row, second from my right.
Yes, thank you. I'm Cindy Sain with the Voice of America. And you mentioned that the president has had some harsh words for traditional U.S. allies. And the other side of that is that he has lavished praise on the North Korean leader and the Russian president and some other authoritarian leaders. Does your survey say anything about how Americans view that? You think that will be important for them when they go to the voting booths? Thank you.
We didn't really ask about that. We have asked about opinions of those leaders, which are low, of like Putin and Kim Jong-un, higher among Republicans, but just it's still just a small minority. I would say more, I think that perhaps this presidential election round more than others, people will, I think, be judging just the character and the way the president imports himself to our allies in the world. So it's even more diffuse than a specific policy or specific leader, and that's how it might come into play.
Other questions? In the back, right there, and then we'll go to you, sort of in the center.
Thank you, Erin Hurley. My question, it has to do with on page 16 when we're looking at making the U.S. safe, maintaining U.S. military superiority. I wondered if the panel would just reflect on that finding in particular in the current 2020 Democratic presidential field, and the fact that Joe Biden is the only one who seems to be standing fully in line with these findings.
Anybody? Richard?
Well, I was going to say I'm not the right person probably to answer this, but it's Washington, so what the hell? I mean, one, I think you have to attribute to candidates their own views and not just responsiveness to the voting public. And so we shouldn't imagine that they're only a mirror of what the public would support. And two, you have to look at where I think the intellectual energy is on the Democratic side during the primaries, which is to move in a more progressive foreign policy direction, which means cutting the defense budget, for example, in order to plow those funds into domestic priorities. And again, beyond Vice President Biden, it seems that tends to be the talking point from most of the other candidates who've spoken out on that. So it's not, I would suppose that if you asked a Democratic candidate, would you rather be militarily superior or inferior? I can't imagine anybody would say inferior, but of course there's a cost associated with superiority, and the priority right now is moving those costs associated with lots and lots of superiority into domestic priorities. Whereas on the Republican side, I think there's part of this is specifically related to the China threat. The idea is if China's investing in all these kinds of things, and yes, we'd love to have domestic priorities, but because of the nature of the threat that we attribute to China in the future, it is worth now investing more in the military than we otherwise would.
The issue of increased defense spending in particular is one that splits the moderates and conservatives among the Democrats, between moderate Democrats and liberal Democrats. So that might be why they're trying to perhaps avoid that topic or not hammer on it too hard right now. Also, I think the American public just takes it for granted that we would maintain this because we've had it for years and they've supported it for decades.
I'd also add that the energy in the Democratic side is around other issues.
Yeah.
I don't think this gets the attention it could. And certainly, as one who represented a defense-dependent district, I had a lot of constituents who were Democrats and Republicans who supported robust defense spending, as I did. But I think now the focus is on climate change and some cultural issues and so forth. And that's where the candidates that's what they're talking about. There's someone in there she is, sort of in the middle, on the other side, back there, and then we'll go to you in front, and we're running out of time, so maybe we'll do a lightning round and take the last three questions. I think that might be best. We'll take yours. Identify yourself, please, and ask your question, then we'll take yours. And do we
Dessler, USAID. I wondered if you looked underneath the third priority, which is promoting democratic and human rights around the world, and how people thought we ought to do that, since, of course, that's part of AID's mission.
Okay, good. Succinct question, and we'll take this one. Don't answer yet, the one in front, and then we'll have a wrap up by each candidate who can answer these questions and make any other comments they would like to.
Richard Coleman, CBP, retired. Do you have a question that sharpened the focus on what was called nation building and how feckless it is to go to places like Afghanistan that have no democratic tradition or even capacity that we can see?
Okay. Who goes first? Ivo?
So on the question of how to promote democracy and human rights around the world, we didn't ask the how, we asked the whether. And to see whether Americans think in general, do they think promoting democracy and human rights is useful for making America safe or not? Is it part of how we actively engage? But the question of how to do that, we didn't go into in detail. In the past, we have asked questions, should we use U.S. troops for this purpose? And that's when support for using force as a means to promote democracy and human rights tends to be lower than certainly this finding, where about two-thirds of Americans, 56% of Americans think it makes us safer if we promote democracy and human rights.
Yeah, and I think the two are connected, the promoting democracy and human rights and the nation building. In terms, and I think that's right, promoting democracy and human rights around the world can be done in many diplomatic ways. And I think that's probably what the American public has in mind in that particular question. On nation building, as Ivo talked about earlier, the American public is willing to use the U.S. troops to defend the United States or its allies against direct threats. But they don't support the use of U.S. forces in getting involved in conflicts overseas that are within their own internal politics. They don't want to get involved in other civil wars like Syria. They will support sending U.S. troops to fight ISIS, but not to get involved in the Syrian civil war. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but yeah, there's not a lot of support for nation building in terms of a military way.
Maybe I'll just use this opportunity to make one last point that hasn't come up so far, which is, in addition to the trade numbers being so high, the thing that I found so striking in the poll was actually on page 34 when it asks Americans what the threats to the United States were. Yesterday, our Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, said in a speech that great power competition is the national security focus of the United States. Great power competition means China and Russia. His predecessor, Jim Mattis, said that great power competition, not terrorism, is the top challenge to U.S. defense policy, and the national security strategy and the national defense strategy both reflect that. And if there's anything approaching a consensus in Washington on these issues, it's that great power competition is the thing we've got to hyper-focus on. But look at page 34 when they ask what are the threats to the United States. Russia and China are all the way down the list. So ahead of Russia and China, you got cyber attacks, terrorism, North Korea, Iran, climate change, foreign interference, political polarization, arms races, immigrants, refugees. All of those things are seen as greater priorities in this poll than the military power of Russia or the development of China as a world power. That shows a great power disconnect between the policymakers and the public that is going to potentially have fairly profound impacts. The numbers on China are rising, but they're still way below all these other things. And if the policymakers who talk about great power competition are right that this is going to require sort of a whole of society effort to wage a long-term competition, particularly with China, the American people certainly do not seem to be there. And so not only does that suggest to me that there's work to do in addressing that gap, but it also suggests to me that you can't do great power competition unless you also address these other issues that the American people care about.
And that's a good place to end. Let me just add a point, which is that for 16 years or so after 9/11, all of our security doctrine focused basically exclusively on counterterrorism. We were attacked, we were shocked, we put in place a number of policies. I was involved in a lot of that, some of which worked, some of which were overcorrections. And now we haven't abandoned the goal, but we're now focused on something else. The American people are saying through this very good polling, wait a minute, this is what we care about. This is what our country stands for. And it's very important to step back and take a deep breath and try to make sure that what's going on in this bubble of Washington is in touch with the country. And that's what the Chicago Council has done again, and that's what it has showed up to present here again. And that is why we're very happy to host these things. And the 6th rodeo starts a year from now. And we'll hope, at least I will hope, that Woodrow Wilson, the president, and certainly the Woodrow Wilson Center, will be very proud of the people of this country who have made their voices heard and really want a foreign policy that reflects their values, which I think are enduring American values. So thank you, folks, for coming on over and sharing some really detailed and interesting findings with everybody.
Thank you very much.